The winter wind extinguished the cathedral candles as the Alpha King crossed the threshold. I stared at the marble floor, waiting for him to realize the deception. I was merely a street seamstress, hired as a decoy to take an assassin's blade for the true noble bride hiding behind the velvet curtains. His heavy boots bypassed her alcove. The scent of pine and cold iron washed over me. A leather-gloved hand pushed back my lace veil. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for a fatal strike. Instead, rough fingers traced the fresh needle pricks on my thumb. Metal slid against my skin. I opened my eyes and found the sovereign's gold signet ring resting heavily on my calloused hand. The deadly trap that brought me to this altar had been set in motion hours earlier. The heavy silk of the wedding gown felt like a suffocating shroud against Wren's skin. She stood frozen at the center of the cathedral altar. Cold drafts swept through the high stone arches. Only hours ago, her needle had stitched the very pearls she now wore. "Keep your veil down and your mouth shut," Lord Vane hissed from the shadows. His hand gripped her arm with bruising force. "You are a decoy, nothing more." Wren nodded silently. She was only a seamstress from the lower district. Silver coins jingled in her pocket. They were the meager price paid for her life. She had been hired to draw the assassin's blade away from the true bride. Lady Alara hid safely in the eastern alcove behind velvet curtains. The nobility murmured in the wooden pews. They were waiting for the ceremony to begin. No one knew what to expect from the incoming sovereign. Toran had burned 3 rebel cities to ash in a single night. Rumors claimed his own council members would rather stare at the floor than meet his eyes. He was a warlord who ruled through fear. Marriage to him was considered a death sentence by the northern houses. A sudden horn blast shattered the whispers in the hall. The heavy oak doors groaned open. Wind rushed into the cathedral. It extinguished a dozen wax candles along the aisle. Toran crossed the threshold. Heavy boots echoed against the marble floor. The murmuring crowd fell into a terrified silence. Nobles bowed their heads. Some averted their gazes as if looking at him would invite a curse. Wren kept her chin tucked beneath the thick lace. She could hear the erratic pounding of her own heart. The rhythmic footsteps grew louder. They sounded like a war drum beating a final countdown. Each step carried a terrifying, deliberate weight. Wren stared at the hem of her gown. She prayed to the old gods for a swift end. She expected him to turn toward the eastern alcove. That was where the true noble bloodline waited. The footsteps bypassed the velvet curtains. Wren stopped breathing. The scent of pine and cold iron washed over her. A shadow fell across her veiled face. Toran stopped directly in front of the altar. The presiding priest took a nervous step backward. "Look at me," a voice commanded. It was deep and steady. Wren trembled. She was unable to force her muscles to obey. She clamped her hands over her bouquet. A leather-gloved hand reached out. Fingers brushed against the edge of her veil. He pushed the lace back over her shoulders. Wren squeezed her eyes shut. She waited for a blade to strike her neck. "Open your eyes," Toran said. She obeyed slowly. She found herself staring into a pair of sharp amber eyes. He wore dark armor polished to a dull gleam. A wolf pelt rested across his broad shoulders. He did not look like a mindless beast. He looked like a man who carried the weight of a fractured kingdom. His jaw was set in a hard, unforgiven line. Lord Vane stepped forward from the shadows. Panic etched his high-pitched voice. "Your Grace, wait." Toran did not even turn his head. "That is merely a servant," Vane stammered. He pointed a trembling finger toward the eastern wall. The true Lady Alara awaits you in the alcove. Torin finally shifted his gaze toward the nobleman. Silence, he commanded. The single word froze the entire cathedral. Lord Vane stumbled backward as if physically struck. Torin turned his attention back to Ren. He reached into his dark cloak. He withdrew a heavy band of forged gold. It was the sovereign's signet ring. Ren tried to pull her hands away. Torin caught her left wrist. His grip was firm but gentle. His thumb brushed over the needle pricks on her fingers. These were the hands of a worker. They lacked the smooth perfection of a pampered lady. He looked down at her rough skin. A strange expression flickered across his stoic face. He slid the gold ring onto her finger. The metal felt heavy and warm against her flesh. He did not question her ragged fingernails. He did not demand the noble bride. "I know exactly who I am marrying," Torin said softly. He leaned in closer. His breath brushed against her ear, meant for her alone. "The carriage is waiting, my queen." The carriage wheels rattled violently against the uneven cobblestone road. Frost clung to the iron bars of the small windows. Ren sat frozen on the velvet bench. She kept her hands tightly folded over her lap. The heavy signet ring dragged her left hand downward. It served as a constant reminder of her impossible situation. Across the narrow space sat the warlord, Torne remained motionless in the shadows. He did not attempt to initiate any conversation. His gaze was fixed somewhere beyond the frosted glass. Panic gnawed at the edges of Ren's sanity. She rehearsed a dozen different apologies in her mind. None of them seemed capable of stopping a blade. Lord Vane had assured her the king would never notice a veiled face. The nobility viewed commoners as interchangeable props. Yet Torin had walked directly to her. He had bypassed the alcove without a second glance. How did he know the truth? Why did he accept a seamstress as his bride? The questions echoed loudly in her head. She did not dare to speak them aloud. The air inside the carriage grew colder as they left the city limits. Ren shivered beneath the thin silk of her wedding gown. She tried to suppress the involuntary tremors. Drawing attention to herself felt like a fatal mistake. Torin shifted his weight on the wooden seat. Leather creaked in the quiet space. Ren clamped her jaw shut. She braced for a sudden accusation. He only reached up to adjust the metal clasp of his cloak. The journey continued in agonizing silence. An iron portcullis rove with a deafening screech in the distance. The carriage rolled into the courtyard of the Black Keep. Torches cast long shadows across the snow-covered grounds. Armed guards stood in rigid formation along the battlements. They lowered their steel spears as the vehicle came to a halt. A footman rushed forward to pull the heavy door open. Torin stepped out into the freezing night air. He did not offer a hand to help her down. Ren gathered her voluminous skirts. She stumbled slightly on the iron step. Her thin shoes hit the freezing mud. The wind howled through the dark pines. It cut through her dress like a physical blow. Torin began walking toward the main keep. His long strides forced her to almost run to keep up. Stone gargoyles glared down from the high walls. The architecture prioritized war rather than comfort. They passed through a cavernous entrance hall. Servants bowed low against the stone walls. No one dared to look up at the new queen. Ren felt like a prisoner marching toward the gallows. They climbed a steep spiral staircase. Her breathing grew shallow and erratic. Torin maintained a relentless pace. His armor clanked softly with every step. They finally reached the highest tower. 2 armored sentries pulled open a massive oak door. Torin gestured for her to enter the room. Ren stepped over the raised threshold. The door slammed shut behind her with a dreadful thud. She was entirely alone in the vast room. Torin had not followed her inside. A massive four-poster bed dominated the center of the chamber. Thick velvet curtains surrounded the mattress. A meager fire crackled in the stone hearth. It offered little warmth against the pervasive chill. Ren hugged her arms across her chest. She began to pace across the woven rugs. Her mind raced through terrible scenarios. Perhaps he had gone to fetch the executioner. Maybe the council was drawing up her death warrant. She looked down at her rough hands. The gold ring mocked her lowly status. She tried to pull it off her finger. The metal refused to budge past her knuckle. Tears of frustration pricked the corners of her eyes. She blinked them away fiercely. Crying would not save her from the warlord's wrath. Hours seemed to crawl by in the silent room. The fire burned down to glowing embers. The cold crept up from the stone floor. Ren abandoned her frantic pacing. She stood rigidly near the hearth to siphon its fading heat. Her legs ached from standing in the tight shoes. She refused to sit on the royal bed. Taking any liberties might invite immediate punishment. She was a trespasser in a royal sanctuary. The howling wind rattled the window panes. Every sudden noise made her jump. She listened intently for footsteps in the stone corridor. Only the sound of the winter storm answered her. Exhaustion began to war with her terror. Her eyelids grew heavy. She pinched her own wrist to stay awake. Meeting death in her sleep felt cowardly. She wanted to face her judgment with open eyes. The memories of her past life flickered through her mind. Only yesterday she was sewing hems in a damp basement. The contrast between the tailor shop and this fortress disoriented her. She traced the intricate embroidery on her bodice. Her own needlework now felt like a suffocating trap. The heavy latch clicked loudly in the quiet room.
Wen flinched violently. She backed up against the stone mantel. The heavy oak door swung inward. Torin stepped over the threshold. He had removed his chest plate. A dark tunic stretched across his broad chest. He held a heavy broadsword in his right hand. Ren stared at the polished steel blade. Her breath hitched in her throat. This was the exact moment of her execution. Torin closed the door with his boot heel. He walked toward a wooden table near the window. He set the sword down with a loud clatter. The sharp sound made Ren jump again. He turned to look at her. His amber eyes were unreadable in the dim light. He did not yell. He did not demand to know her true identity. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Ren forced herself to speak. Her voice emerged as a weak rasp. "I can explain, Your Grace." Torin held up a single hand. The gesture silenced her instantly. He began to walk slowly toward the hearth. Ren squeezed her eyes shut. She pressed her back hard against the cold stone. She waited for hands to wrap around her throat. She waited for the accusation of high treason. Nothing happened. She heard the rustle of heavy fabric. A sudden weight settled over her shoulders. Ren gasped and opened her eyes. Torin stood mere inches away. He had removed his wolf pelt. The thick fur was now draped over her shivering frame. Residual heat from his body radiated from the animal skin. It wrapped her in a cocoon of unexpected warmth. Ren stared up at him in utter confusion. Her mind struggled to process the gentle action. This was the tyrant who leveled rebel cities. This was the beast who ruled through undeniable bloodshed. Torin looked down at her trembling hands. He reached out slowly. Ren braced for immediate pain. His rough fingers merely brushed against the gold ring. He adjusted the heavy pelt to cover her bare neck. "The stone walls hold the winter chill," Torin said quietly. His deep voice lacked any trace of malice. He did not offer a comforting smile. He stepped back from the stone hearth. He walked toward a leather chair in the far corner. He sat down heavily. He stretched his long legs out toward the dying fire. He closed his eyes. Wren stood frozen by the fireplace. She clutched the edges of the wolf pelt. The fur smelled of pine needles and wood smoke. She realized he was not going to kill her tonight. He was not even going to question her presence. The warlord was simply going to sleep in the chair. Wren watched his chest rise and fall in a steady rhythm. The immediate danger had passed. The true mystery had only just begun. Why would a monster wrap his prey in warmth? Sunlight pierced the frosted window panes. Wren opened her eyes slowly. The wolf pelt weighed heavily on her shoulders. She inhaled the lingering scent of wood smoke and pine. The leather chair sat empty in the pale morning light. Torin had vanished before the castle truly awoke. She pushed herself up from the stone floor. Her muscles ached from sleeping near the hard hearth. The massive bed remained untouched behind its velvet curtains. Silence hung thickly in the royal chamber. Wren folded the fur cloak with careful hands. She placed it gently over the arm of the wooden chair. Her gaze wandered across the stark room. Military maps covered a wide oak table. Scattered iron weights lay near the wardrobe. This was the sanctuary of a warlord. It held no soft tapestries or decorative silver mirrors. Everything served a practical, ruthless purpose. Wren felt profoundly out of place in her silk gown. She found a linen dress draped over a wooden chest. A servant must have slipped inside while she slept. She changed out of the heavy wedding attire. The simple fabric offered an immense physical relief. She walked toward the tall wardrobe. A dark surcoat hung haphazardly from a metal hook. The henza was caked with dried mud. A jagged tear ruined the thick wool near the shoulder. It looked like the result of a careless training spar. Wren ran her thumb along the frayed edges. Her fingers recognized the high quality of the weave. An overwhelming urge to fix the damage washed over her. It was the only useful skill she possessed in this world. Sewing offered a familiar comfort in this terrifying place. Wren cracked the heavy door open. 2 armored guards snapped to attention in the corridor. Their hands hovered nervously near their sword hilts. "I need a needle and thread," Wren whispered. The men exchanged a bewildered look. One guard nodded and hurried down the spiral stairs. He returned minutes later with a terrified maid. The young girl thrust a wooden sewing box toward Wren. She bowed low, her forehead nearly touched the flagstones. "Thank you," Wren said saltly. The maid scrambled away without meeting her eyes. Wren retreated into the quiet chamber.
She carried the damaged surcoat to the window seat. The winter sun provided just enough light for the intricate work. She threaded a fine iron needle with practiced ease. The first stitch pierced the thick wool. Tension slowly drained from her stiff shoulders. The rhythmic pull of the thread quieted her racing mind. The needle darted through the fabric like a silver fish. Every stitch pulled the torn edges closer together. She thought of the man who wore this heavy garment. Rumors painted him as a monster who drank blood. The man who offered his cloak last night was someone else entirely. She tied off the thread with a tiny knot. She bit the end of the string to break it cleanly. She smoothed the mended area with her palm. The wool felt rough and durable beneath her skin. It reminded her of his quiet strength in the carriage. Hours slipped away unnoticed in the cold room. She repaired the torn shoulder with a reinforced seam. She mended loose threads along the bottom hem. Her hands moved with a swift grace. This labor felt like a silent conversation with the absent king. She could not offer him political alliances or military strength. She could only offer the meticulous labor of her hands. She walked back to the leather chair and draped the garment.
She arranged the sleeves so the silver crest was visible. The wolf emblem caught the dim afternoon light. Shadows lengthened across the stone floor. The winter wind resumed its relentless howling outside. Wren realized the room was growing dangerously cold. Torin would return to a freezing chamber. She walked over to the stone hearth. A stack of chopped firewood rested against the wall. She knelt and began to arrange the heavy logs. Her hands acquired fresh splinters from the rough bark. She used a flint striker to ignite the dry kindling. Flames slowly caught the edges of the wood. Warm light chased the shadows away from the bed. Wren requested a pot of tea from the evening servants. A maid brought a ceramic tray with trembling hands. The smell of roasted herbs filled the enclosed space. Wren placed the tray on a small table near the fire. She sat on the edge of the hearth and waited. The castle beyond the door grew noisy. Shouts echoed from the lower courtyard. Iron gates clanged shut against the winter storm. Heavy boots thundered across the stone bridges. The king had returned to his fortress. Wren felt her pulse quicken with sudden anxiety. She smoothed the skirt of her linen dress. She wondered if he would banish her to the dungeons tonight. The leniency of the first night might have been a fluke. Footsteps approached the royal chamber. They carried that same deliberate weight from the cathedral. The brass latch clicked sharply. The door swung open to reveal the towering monarch. Torin stood framed in the dark archway. A layer of fresh snow clung to his dark armor. His expression was a mask of told exhaustion. He carried the harsh scent of freezing wind and metal. His amber eyes swept across the room. He stopped abruptly in the doorway. He stared at the blazing fire in the hearth. His gaze shifted to the mended surcoat on the chair. Finally, he looked at Wren. She stood up respectfully near the stone mantel. Torin stepped inside and closed the door. The oppressive aura of command radiated from his broad shoulders. He seemed ready to issue a harsh reprimand. Wren gestured timidly toward the small table. "I asked the kitchens for hot tea, Your Grace." Her voice trembled slightly in the quiet room. Torin did not move for a long moment. He looked from the fire to the tea to her face. His amber eyes searched her features for any sign of deception. He found only a nervous tailor standing by the hearth. He unbuckled his sword belt with a slow motion. The weapon clattered against the stone floor. He removed his steel gauntlets one by one. He tossed them onto the oak desk. He walked toward the fire with silent steps. The intimidating presence around him seemed to retract. The tension in his broad shoulders noticeably dropped. It was as if a predatory beast was sheathing its claws. He sighed quietly. The sound was a rare admission of human exhaustion. Torin halted near the small table. He looked down at the steaming ceramic pot. Wren stepped forward to pour the dark liquid. Her knuckles were white with tension. She filled a modest clay cup and offered it to him. Torin reached out to accept the drink. His large hand dwarfed the fragile cup. Their fingers brushed for a fraction of a second. His skin was freezing cold from the outdoor patrol. Wren pulled her hand back instantly. Torin brought the cup to his lips. He drank the hot tea in silence. The rigid line of his jaw began to soften. He lowered the empty cup. His gaze locked onto the mended surcoat across the room. He walked over and picked up the dark wool. His thumb traced the invisible seam on the shoulder. "You possess skilled hands," Torin stated flatly. He did not look at her when he spoke. Wren lowered her head in a humble nod. "It is my only trade," she answered softly. Torin tossed the garment back onto the chair. He turned to face her fully in the firelight. "Queens do not mend armor." His voice carried a strange, unreadable tone. Wren gripped the edge of her simple apron. "I am not a true queen," she whispered. She braced herself for his inevitable anger. Torin took a deliberate step closer to her. The heat from the hearth illuminated the sharp angles of his face. "The ring remains on your finger," he countered quietly. He looked down at her rough hands again. "You brought fire to a dead room." He reached out and gently took her empty teacup. He placed it back onto the wooden tray. "Do not undermine the value of your trade, Wren." Her breath caught in her throat. It was the first time he had spoken her real name. How did the King of the North know the name of a street tailor? She opened her mouth to ask the dangerous question. A sudden frantic knock shattered the quiet intimacy of the room. A soldier shouted through the thick door, "Your Grace, an assassin has breached the lower courtyard." The sudden shout shattered the quiet atmosphere of the royal chamber. Torrin turned his head toward the oak door. His amber eyes hardened into shards of cold glass. He did not reach for his discarded sword. He simply shifted his weight to place his body between Wren and the entrance. Footsteps thundered up the stone stairwell. The sounds of clashing steel echoed through the narrow corridor. Someone had bypassed the outer defenses of the fortress. Wren backed away from the hearth. Her pulse hammered wildly against her ribs. The wooden door suddenly splintered inward with a deafening crack. A man dressed in dark leather lunged into the room. He held a curved dagger in his left hand. A slender sword gleamed in his right grip. 2 royal guards lay motionless in the hallway behind him. The assassin did not look at the warlord. His crazed eyes locked directly onto Wren. He wore the silver crest of House Vane on his chest. The noble family refused to accept their lost opportunity. They intended to remove the decoy to reinstate their true daughter. The intruder leapt over the shattered doorframe. He moved with a desperate, terrifying speed. The silver blade thrust straight toward Wren's chest. Wren could not command her legs to run. She threw her hands up in a futile, defensive gesture. A sudden rush of wind displaced the air in the room. Torrin intercepted the strike before the blade could connect. He did not draw a weapon. His bare left hand thrust directly into the path of the steel. The sharp edge sliced into his palm. A metallic screech echoed as the blade hit his bones. Wren screamed. Torrin did not flinch. His large fingers closed tightly around the sharp metal. The assassin gasped in raw shock. He tried to pull his weapon free from the iron grape. The warlord held the blade immovable. Blood dripped steadily from Torrin's clenched fist onto the stone floor. Red drops formed a dark puddle near Wren's shoes. Torrin twisted his wrist with a brutal, sickening motion. The tempered steel snapped in half with a loud crack. He discarded the broken metal shard onto the rug. The assassin stumbled backward in terror. He realized he had just attacked a living nightmare. Torrin closed the distance in a single stride. His right hand shot forward like a striking snake. He grabbed the assassin by the leather collar. He lifted the grown man off the floor. The intruder kicked his legs frantically in the empty air. Torrin slammed him against the stone wall. The impact knocked the breath from the killer's lungs. "Lord Vane sends a clumsy rat into my domain," Torrin growled. His voice was a low, terrifying rumble. He dropped the gasping man onto the floor. His boot kicked the remaining dagger into the hallway. More footsteps echoed down the spiral stairs. A dozen armored sentries rushed into the ruined doorway. Several high-ranking council members trailed closely behind them. They had followed the commotion from the lower hall. Lord Vane stood among the breathless nobles. His pale face drained of all remaining color. He stared at the subdued assassin wearing his family crest. The council members froze at the threshold. They surveyed the broken door and the bleeding king. Silence descended upon the chaotic room. Torrin turned slowly to face the terrified audience. Blood continued to run down his fingers. He ignored the severe wound. His boots carried him back toward the fireplace. He stopped directly beside Wren. She stood trembling against the stone mantel. Her wide eyes were fixated on his bleeding hand. Torin reached out with his uninjured right hand. He grasped her rough fingers firmly. He pulled her forward to stand beside him. The warlord no longer hid her behind his broad frame. His intention was to make every nobleman see her clearly. "Hear my words," Torin commanded the room. His voice echoed off the high arches. "This woman wears the royal signet ring." He raised their joined hands into the firelight. "She is the sole queen of this territory." The nobles exchanged frightened, nervous glances. Lord Vane opened his mouth to protest. He intended to expose her lowly origins to the court. Torin cut him off with a single glare. "Anyone who questions her right to stand here will answer to my blade." He looked down at the bleeding assassin. "Take this trash to the dungeons." 2 guards rushed forward to drag the whimpering man away. The council members began to bow their heads respectfully. They realized the warlord had made his final choice. He did not care about noble bloodlines or political alliances. He had chosen the street tailor. Torin squeezed Ren's hand gently. His thumb brushed over her racing pulse. The terrifying monarch offered her a silent reassurance. Ren looked up at his stoic profile. She realized the depth of the protection he had just offered. He had spilled his own blood to secure her survival. The crowd of nobles slowly retreated from the chamber. The guards pulled the ruined door shut as best they could. The room fell quiet once again. Ren looked down at his left hand. The deep gash stretched across his palm. Dark blood stained the edge of his dark tunic. He flexed his injured fingers with a grimace. Ren instinctively stepped closer to him. She forgot her fear of the tyrant. She reached out toward his bleeding hand. "You are hurt," she whispered. Torin looked down at her small fingers hovering near his wound. He slowly turned his hand over to show her the damage. "This is merely a scratch," he replied softly. Ren shook her head in disagreement. She gently cradled his large hand in her own. His blood smeared across her pale skin. She did not pull away from the grim sight. She guided him toward the leather chair near the fire. Torin followed her lead without any resistance. He sat heavily onto the cushions. Ren fetched a clean linen towel from the washstand. She knelt on the stone floor beside his boots. She pressed the cloth firmly against the deep cut. Torin hissed quietly as the fabric touched the torn flesh. Ren looked up into his amber eyes. She saw exhaustion hiding behind his fierce demeanor. She noticed the edge of his collar had slipped during the fight. Thick scars vanished beneath the fabric of his tunic. They looked like old burns or deep lash marks. Ren realized the warlord carried more wounds than the one on his hand. She gently lifted the edge of his blood-stained sleeve. She wondered what other pain this terrifying man was hiding. Blood stained the coarse linen cloth. Ren pressed the fabric firmly against his palm. Torin watched her movements in silence. The fire crackled softly in the stone hearth. Cold wind blew through the shattered oak door. Guards shifted nervously in the dark hallway. "Leave us," Torin commanded without raising his voice. Footsteps retreated quickly down the spiral stairs. Only the winter storm remained to witness them. Ren fetched a small basin from the washstand. Clean water sloshed against the wooden edges. She knelt beside the leather chair once again. She carefully washed the drying blood from his fingers. Her thumb mapped the heavy calluses on his skin. He did not possess the smooth hands of a nobleman. These were the hands of a hardened soldier. Torin allowed her to direct his arm. His absolute stillness unnerved her slightly. Predators usually paced when they were injured. Dark liquid soaked the cuff of his tunic. "You must remove this garment," Ren whispered softly. She tied off the clean bandage on his hand. "The fabric will dry against your remaining wounds." Torin studied her face for a long moment. He saw no pity in her amber eyes. He saw only the practical resolve of a worker. He reached for the laces at his collar. His uninjured hand pulled the leather strings loose. Ren stepped back to give him space. He pulled the heavy wool over his head. He tossed the ruined shirt onto the floorboards. Ren stopped breathing. The firelight illuminated the expanse of his bare back. It was a landscape of historical violence. Silver lines crisscrossed over his heavy muscles. Some marks looked like the result of deep lashes. Others resembled the jagged edges of a heated blade. No human skin should survive such relentless brutality. He carried a map of agony beneath his armor. Rumors said he burned 3 cities in unprovoked wrath. The truth etched into his flesh told a different story. He had been forged in unspeakable torment. Ren did not scream. She did not cover her mouth in polite horror. She walked toward a wooden chest near the bed. Her hands found a small jar of medicinal salve. The scent of crushed mint filled the cold air. She returned to the chair with deliberate steps. Torrens sat motionless, facing the warm hearth. His broad shoulders were rigid with unspoken tension. He expected her to recoil from his monstrous appearance. Ren scooped a portion of ointment onto her fingers. She stepped close to his exposed back. "This will be cold," she warned quietly. Her fingertips made contact with his ruined skin. A violent shudder ripped through his massive frame. Ren kept her hand steady against his shoulder. She did not pull away from his sudden flinch. She began to massage the salve into the deepest scar. Her touch was incredibly light and precise. She traced the raised tissue with a reverence he had never known. Torren bowed his head slowly. His chin rested against his bare chest. A hollow exhale escaped his lips. The warlord surrendered to the gentle pressure. Ren worked in methodical silence. She coated every jagged line with the soothing herbs. Her rough fingertips caught on the uneven scars. It felt like mending a torn tapestry. She treated his broken body with profound respect. Minutes stretched into an hour. The blazing logs settled into glowing ash. Torren did not move to break the physical connection. He leaned slightly backward into her touch. It was a silent plea for her to continue. Ren obliged without question. She understood the language of silent suffering. Poverty had taught her how to endure pain alone. She recognized a fellow survivor in this terrifying king. She smoothed the last drop of the salve over his shoulder blade. Her hands rested gently against his warm skin. Neither of them spoke a word. The space between them felt charged with unspoken promises. Torren finally turned his head to look at her. His profile caught the dim orange light. "They chained me in a dark pit for 10 years, he said. His voice barely rose above a whisper. Ren felt a fresh ache bloom in her chest. She stepped around the chair to face him. She did not offer hollow words of comfort. She simply placed her hand over his bandaged palm. Torren turned his hand to lace his fingers with hers. He pulled her closer until her knees bumped his boots. He pressed her knuckles against his own forehead. The feared sovereign closed his eyes before a seamstress. He offered his most vulnerable angle to a stranger. Ren looked down at his dark hair. She fought the urge to smooth the messy strands. A sharp horn blast suddenly pierced the night sky. The warning signal echoed across the northern mountains. Torren opened his eyes instantly. The tender vulnerability vanished from his gaze. The warlord returned to the surface in a single heartbeat. The second horn blast echoed against the stone walls. Torren stood up immediately. The tender vulnerability vanished from his amber eyes. He reached for a clean linen shirt. His hands moved with ruthless, practiced speed. He strapped the steel chest plate over the dark fabric. Ren watched his rapid transformation in silence. The quiet man she had just treated disappeared beneath heavy armor. He picked up his broadsword from the oak table. He paused near the shattered doorway. Torren unclasped his heavy winter cloak. He tossed the black fabric onto the velvet bed. "Do not leave this tower," Torren commanded.
His voice held the unforgiving edge of a military general. He did not wait for her verbal confirmation. His heavy boots thundered down the spiral staircase. Ren remained alone in the freezing chamber. Dawn slowly broke over the northern mountains. The sky retained a bruised purple hue. She paced across the woven rugs to stay warm. The fortress outside her window erupted into chaotic noise. Horses whinnied in the lower courtyard. Iron gates clanged open to release the marching army. The noise eventually faded into the distance. An eerie silence settled over the Black Keep. Footsteps approached her room hours later. They lacked the heavy rhythm of royal guards. 4 elderly councilmen stepped over the ruined doorframe. Lord Vane led the hostile delegation into the chamber. He held a rolled parchment in his pale hands. 2 armed mercenaries followed closely behind the nobles. The king's personal sentries were suspiciously absent. Ren stopped pacing near the hearth. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She fused her spine to remain perfectly straight. Lord Vane unrolled the thick parchment on the wooden desk. "The warlord marches toward the eastern border," Vane announced. His voice dripped with arrogant disdain. "He cannot protect a street rat today." He slapped the document against the flat surface. A black iron pen rested next to the paper. "Sign this annulment decree," the nobleman demanded. He pointed a bony finger at the bottom line. "The blind line lies strictly forbid a union with a peasant."
Ren looked at the dark ink. The elegant letters promised her a safe passage back to the slums. She only needed to renounce her false title. The council members expected her to cry. They anticipated a swift surrender from a terrified girl. Ren looked past them toward the velvet bed. The black wolf cloak rested against the pillows. She remembered the horrific scars carving up Torin's back. He'd had endured a decade of unimaginable darkness. He had trusted her with his most vulnerable truth. She refused to betray that silent vow for her own safety. Ren walked deliberately toward the mattress. She picked up the heavy garment. She draped the black fur over her own shoulders. The silver wolf emblem rested heavily against her collarbone. The masculine garment swallowed her small frame. It also radiated a fierce, undeniable authority. Ren turned back to face the treacherous delegation. She did not reach for the iron pen. She stepped toward the oak desk with steady feet. Lord Vane frowned deeply at her unexpected defiance. "Sign the paper, Taylor," he growled. Ren picked up the parchment. She looked Vane directly in his pale eyes. "You invoke ancient laws to hide your own cowardice." Her voice did not tremble or break. The words rang clearly across the stone room. The other councilmen exchanged nervous, uncertain glances. They had come to bully a weeping victim. They were now facing a woman cloaked in the sovereign's shadow. Ren gripped the edges of the thick paper. She ripped the decree straight down the center. The tearing sound echoed loudly in the tense silence. She dropped the ruined halves onto the floorboards. Lord Vane turned a dangerous shade of red. "You arrogant fool," he spat. He signaled the mercenaries to step forward. The armed men drew their iron swords simultaneously. Ren stood her ground near the blazing hearth. She raised her left hand into the pale morning light. The golden signet ring caught the faint sunbeams. "I wear the royal crest," Ren stated firmly. "Strike me down and invite his wrath upon your families." She took a deliberate step closer to the naked blades. She channeled Torin's unyielding, predatory gaze. "Do you truly believe he will show you mercy?" The mercenaries hesitated in their tracks. They knew Torin had burned cities for lesser insults. Their swords wavered in the cold drafts. Lord Vane cursed violently under his breath. He realized his intimidation tactic had completely failed. The seamstress possessed a spine forged from iron. The armed men slowly lowered their weapons. No amount of gold was worth facing Torin's legendary vengeance. Lord Vlaine pointed a trembling finger at her face. "You will hang from the battlements when the council convenes," he threatened. He turned and stormed out of the ruined doorway. The other nobles hurried after him in a panicked retreat. The mercenaries sheathed their swords and fled the chamber. Ren listened to their footsteps fading down the stairs. Her knees suddenly lost their rigid strength. She collapsed into the leather chair beside the fire. She wrapped the black cloak tightly around her trembling body. She had survived the bloodless rebellion. She had claimed the throne without shedding a single drop of blood. A sudden, deafening crash interrupted her brief relief. The massive outer courtyard gates slammed against the stone walls. A terrifying familiar roar carried over the winter wind. The iron gates crashed violently against the outer stone walls. Snow swirled madly into the lower courtyard of the Black Keep. Torin rode his warhorse directly through the arched entrance. The exhausted animal panted heavy clouds of white mist into the freezing air. It had been ridden relentlessly across the treacherous mountain trails. The king had never marched to the eastern border. He had intercepted a scout bearing forged military intelligence. The supposed eastern threat was a fabricated lie. It was a calculated diversion orchestrated by factions within his own council. He understood the domestic betrayal instantly. The warlord kicked his heavy boots free of the iron stirrups. He dismounted before the horse even came to a complete halt. His dark armor was covered in a thick layer of winter frost. Ice clung stubbornly to the edges of his wool tunic. He tossed the leather reins to a terrified stable boy. He did not wait for his marching infantry to catch up to him. He had galloped back to the fortress entirely alone. His heavy footsteps hammered a furious rhythm against the frozen mud. The lower courtyard was suspiciously devoid of his personal guard. Torin grabbed a passing servant by the collar of his linen shirt. He hauled the trembling man into the dim glow of a lantern. "Where's my wife?" Torin demanded in a lethal whisper. The servant choked on his own rising terror. He pointed a shaking finger toward the main tower. "Lord Vane took the mercenaries to her chamber," the man stammered. Torin dropped the servant onto the cold ground without a word. A terrifying rage ignited within his amber eyes. The sovereign drew his broadsword from its leather sheath. The steel blade hissed sharply in the quiet winter air. He marched toward the massive entrance of the main keep. Guards stationed at the door took one look at his murderous expression. They wisely stepped aside to let the walking nightmare pass. Torin bypassed the spiral staircase leading to the royal bedchamber. He knew the council was currently gathering in the Great Hall. Lord Vane intended to present the signed annulment decree to the elders. The traitor believed the king was miles away on a fool's errand. Torin crossed the cavernous entrance hall with predatory strides. His wet boots left dark footprints across the pristine marble floor. He reached the towering oak doors of the great hall. He'd not bother to push the brass handles. Torin raised his armored boot and kicked the solid wood. The heavy doors splintered inward with an explosive crack. The sound echoed like cannon fire under the vaulted stone ceiling. Dozens of noblemen jumped frantically from their carved wooden chairs. Lord Vane stood at the head of the long oak table. He held a silver goblet of red wine in his right hand. The metal cup slipped from his fingers and struck the floorboards. Wine spilled across the gray stones like a fresh pool of blood. The councilmen stared in pure horror at the ruined entrance. Torin stood framed in the broken doorway. He looked like a demon summoned directly from the frozen hells. Snow melted and dripped menacingly from his broad shoulders. The drawn broadsword gleamed in the flickering light of the chandeliers. Nobody dared to take a breath in the vast room. Torin stepped over the shattered pieces of the wooden doors. He locked his gaze onto the pale, sweating face of Lord Vane. "You dared to enter my chamber," Torin said. His low voice carried clearly across the silent room. It lacked the deafening volume of a shout. The quiet intensity made it infinitely worse than a scream. Lord Vane backed away from the edge of the wooden table. His legs trembled uncontrollably beneath his expensive silk robes. "Your Grace, it was a matter of state law," Vane sputtered nervously. He searched the shadows of the room for his hired mercenaries. The armed men had fled the castle hours ago in sheer panic. Torin closed the physical distance with terrifying speed. He ignored the other frightened elders cowering in the corners. He grabbed Lord Vane directly by the throat. His steel gauntlet dug painfully into the soft flesh. Torin lifted the older nobleman off the floor with a single arm. Vane kicked his leather shoes wildly in the empty air. His face turned a dangerous shade of purple. "State law does not dictate my marriage," Torin growled. He pressed the sharp edge of his broadsword against Vane's stomach. The cold steel sliced effortlessly through the fine silk fabric. The other councilmen fell heavily to the knees. They begged for mercy with panicked, overlapping voices. Torin did not hear their pathetic pleas. The bloodlust pounded a deafening rhythm in his own ears. He intended to gut the traitor right on the council table. He wanted to paint the ancient stone walls with noble blood. He wanted to send a final message to the ambitious lords. A soft, rustling sound drifted from the broken doorway. The noise was entirely out of place in the chaotic, violent room. It sounded like thick fabric bragging softly against the floorboards. Torin did not turn his head to investigate the sound. He maintained his lethal grip on the choking lord. The kneeling councilmen slowly looked toward the entrance. Their frantic begging died away in their throats. Wren stepped quietly through the shattered doorway. She wore the heavy wolf cloak over her shoulders. The oversized garment swallowed her small frame entirely. She looked incredibly fragile in the center of the cavernous hall. She also looked like the undisputed queen of the north. The silver crest caught the light from the iron sconces. She walked directly into the center of the hostile room. She did not flinch at the sight of the drawn sword. She did not shrink away from the terrifying, bloodthirsty warlord. Wren stopped a few feet away from the violent scene. "Torin," she said clearly. She did not use his formal royal title. She did not address him as a sovereign or a monster. She used the name of the man who had shared his fire with her. Torin froze instantly. The violent muscles in his broad back turned rigid. He kept the sharp blade pressed firmly against Vane's flesh. He slowly turned his head to look at her over his shoulder. His amber eyes were wild and dangerously unfocused. They burned with the unchecked fury of a caged beast. Wren met that terrifying gaze without a single ounce of hesitation. She saw past the armored exterior. She saw the exhausted man who had rushed back through a storm for her protection. Wren took a deliberate step closer to him. The noblemen watched her movements in stunned silence. They expected the unhinged warlord to strike her down. Wren reached out with her bare, scarred hands. She bypassed the threatening edge of the broadsword. She placed her small palms flat against his steel chest plate. The metal armor was freezing cold from the winter storm. She ignored the biting chill against her sensitive skin. Torin stopped breathing entirely. His chest remained perfectly still beneath her gentle hands. Wren slid her fingers upward along the cold, wet armor. She rested her hands against the sides of his tense neck. She stepped bravely into the small space between his broad shoulders. She wrapped her arms around him in a gentle, firm embrace. It was a reckless maneuver in front of the entire court. She pressed her cheek against the center of his chest. She could hear his heart hammering a frantic, violent rhythm. "I am unharmed," Wren whispered. Her soft voice barely carried over the crackling torches.
It was meant for his ears alone. They did not touch me. Torin stared down at the top of her dark hair. The murderous haze began to fracture in his amber eyes. He felt the undeniable warmth of her small body pressing against the frost. He felt the steady, calming rhythm of her breathing against his armor. The red fog of rage slowly receded from his crowded mind. He loosened his iron grip on the choking nobleman. Lord Vane collapsed onto the stone floor in a pathetic heap. He gasped hungrily for the cold air. He scrambled backward like a terrified animal to escape the blade. Torin did not spare the traitor a second glance. His entire universe had narrowed down to the brave woman in his arms. The heavy broadsword slipped from his right hand. The weapon hit the flagstones with a loud, ringing clatter. The sharp sound signaled the end of the impending massacre. The councilmen exhaled collective breaths of profound relief. They realized a genuine miracle had just occurred in the Great Hall. The common seamstress had halted an execution with a single touch. Torin brought his empty hands up to her waist. He returned the embrace with careful, deliberate hesitation. He was acutely aware of his own destructive physical strength. He rested his chin lightly against her soft hair. He closed his eyes and inhaled the familiar scent of crushed mint. The faint smell of the medicinal salve grounded his racing thoughts. He let out a long, ragged sigh of exhaustion. The terrible tension melted from his broad shoulders. He transformed from a mythic warlord back into a mortal man. Wren kept her arms secured safely around his neck. She stroked the damp hair at the nape of his neck. She offered him the same silent comfort she had provided the night before. The great hall remained locked in an awe-struck, heavy silence. The surviving nobles realized they had severely misjudged the decoy bride. She was not a helpless pawn caught in a political game. She held the absolute reins to the most dangerous force in the kingdom. Lord Vane continued to wheeze loudly on the floorboards. He crawled blindly toward the broken doorway to escape the room. Torin opened his amber eyes. He shifted his gaze toward the fleeing traitor. He did not release Wren from his protective, grounding hold. He simply raised his voice to address the silent room. "Strip him of his lands and noble titles," Torin commanded. The order was cold, precise, and absolute. "Throw him into the lowest tier of the northern dungeons." 2 royal guards rushed into the room to execute the command immediately. They dragged the screaming, disgraced nobleman out of the great hall. Torin looked down at the other kneeling elders. "If any man speaks disrespectfully to my wife again, he will lose his tongue." The councilmen bowed their heads until their foreheads touched the dirty floor. They murmured their terrified oaths of total compliance. Torin turned his attention back to Wren. He pumped her face gently with his large, calloused hands. He inspected her pale cheeks for any hidden sign of injury. "You should have stayed in the tower," he murmured softly. Wren smiled with a quiet, undeniable strength. "And miss you destroying the expensive furniture?" she asked quietly. Torin felt a strange warmth bloom deep in his chest. He brushed a stray curl away from her bright eyes. He realized the heavy burden of his crown felt slightly lighter today. He had spent a decade ruling through fear and bloody isolation. He had never expected to find a true partner in the darkness. A sudden commotion echoed fiercely from the outer courtyard. The iron gates crashed against the stone walls once again. A bloodied scout stumbled into the main entrance hall. He pushed violently past the lingering royal guards. He rushed toward the shattered doors of the great hall. He collapsed onto his knees near the abandoned broadsword. "Your Grace?" the scout gasped painfully. He coughed a bright spray of dark blood onto the floorboards. Torin released Wren and stepped forward. His protective, militant stance instantly returned to his frame. "Speak," Torin ordered.
The dying scout raised a trembling hand toward the south. The Southern Coalition has breached the mountain pass. The news sent a physical shockwave through the kneeling council. The Southern Army had been peaceful for over 20 years. They march with 50,000 men, the scout wheezed. They intend to burn the black heap to the ground before morning. The dying scout exhaled his final breath onto the cold stone. Silence descended heavily upon the blood-stained hall. 50,000 men represented an impossible military force. The northern garrison held less than 10,000 capable soldiers. Torin stepped over the lifeless body without a downward glance. He did not look at the trembling councilman. His mind had already transitioned from court politics to brutal warfare. He issued a dozen rapid orders to his surviving commanders. Captains rushed out of the room to rally the northern infantry. Ren watched him orchestrate the sudden defense. He looked like a man forged exclusively for the battlefield. They returned to the highest tower in complete silence. The winter storm continued to batter the frosted windows. Torin walked directly toward his iron armor stand. He discarded his dark tunic onto the floorboards. Ren stepped forward to assist him without needing an invitation. She picked up the heavy steel breastplate. Her arms strained under the sheer weight of the metal. She pressed the cold iron against his broad chest. Torin remained perfectly still as she reached around his waist. She pulled the thick leather straps tight. Her fingers secured the iron buckles with practiced efficiency. She was accustomed to dressing mannequins in a dusty shop. Now she was preparing a sovereign for a desperate war. He handed her the steel pauldrons next. She fastened the shoulder guards over his armored chest. Every piece of metal felt like a physical barrier rising between them. She hated the stark reality of the cold steel. It served as a grim reminder of the impending violence. Torin reached out and caught her busy hands. He stopped her frantic movements entirely. He looked down at her pale face. "You are shaking," Torin observed quietly. Ren pulled her hands away and grabbed his sword belt. "The room is freezing," she lied smoothly. She wrapped the heavy leather that around his hips. She secured the long scabbard against his thigh. He did not press her on the obvious falsehood. A loud horn blasted from the highest watchtower. It signaled the assembly of the northern vanguard. Torin picked up his heavy winter cloak. He draped the dark fabric over his armored shoulders. Ren followed him out of the silent chamber. They descended the spiral staircase together. The lower levels of the black keep buzzed with frantic energy. Soldiers sharpened iron swords on grinding wheels. Servants carried wooden crates of arrows toward the outer walls. Fear painted the young faces of the fresh recruits. Everyone understood the terrifying mathematics of the approaching siege. Torin walked through the crowded courtyard with a steady pace. His calm presence anchored the terrified men. Soldiers stood taller as their king passed by. Ren walked closely at his left side. She still wore the oversized wolf pelt from the morning confrontation. The silver crest marked her as his undeniable equal. No one questioned her presence among the gathering army. They climbed the steep stone steps to the outer battlements. Freezing fog rolled heavily across the high walls. The morning sun remained hidden behind thick gray clouds. Visibility stretched only a few miles into the frozen valley. Torin walked to the edge of the stone parapet. He rested his steel gauntlets on the icy ledge. Ren stood beside him and looked toward the southern horizon. Thousands of distant campfires pierced the dense fog. They looked like a sea of burning stars fallen to the earth.
The Southern coalition had indeed arrived in unimaginable numbers. The sheer scale of the enemy camp made Ren feel physically ill. Torin stared at the invading army with an unreadable expression. He did not display a single trace of fear. He only calculated the grim logistics of the coming slaughter. The wind whipped Ren's dark hair across her face. Torin turned away from the grim horizon. He reached beneath his heavy chest plate. He withdrew a solid object tied to a leather cord. It was a heavy block of forged gold. The royal crest of the North was deeply engraved into the surface. This was the kingdom's official sovereign seal. It held the ultimate power to command armies and empty treasuries.
Torin unfastened the leather cord. He stepped closer to Ren in the freezing mist. He took her right hand and placed the heavy gold into her palm. Ren stared at the object in profound shock. She tried to push it back toward his armored chest. "I cannot take this," Ren whispered frantically. "This belongs to the ruling king." Torin closed her fingers tightly over the cold metal. "It belongs to the person who holds my trust," Torin corrected. His deep voice cut through the howling wind. "The council will attempt to flee if the outer walls fall." He looked back toward the sprawling enemy camp. "They will try to surrender the fortress to save their own lives." He turned his amber eyes back to her face. "You must not let them open the iron gates." Ren gripped the heavy gold seal until her knuckles turned white. She understood the crushing weight of his command. He was placing the survival of the entire territory in her hands. A simple seamstress now held the ultimate authority of the North. "What if you do not return?" Ren asked. Her voice broke on the final word. She hated the sound of her own vulnerability. Torin stepped into her personal space. He removed his steel gauntlets and dropped them onto the stone floor. He reached out with bare hands and framed her face. His thumbs brushed away the stray hairs clinging to her cheeks. He leaned forward slowly. He pressed his forehead firmly against hers. Ren closed her eyes and leaned into the solid contact. The cold metal of his armor dug slightly into her chest. She did not care about the minor discomfort. She wanted to memorize the steady rhythm of his breathing. "I survived 10 years in the dark," Torin murmured against her skin. "A southern army will not keep me in the grave." It was not an arrogant military boast. It was a solemn vow made directly to her soul. Ren reached up and grabbed the lapels of his dark tunic. She anchored herself to his massive frame. "Do not break our promise," she ordered fiercely. Torin let out a quiet breath. He tilted his head slightly. His lips brushed against her temple in a fleeting kiss. It was his first display of deliberate physical affection. The gesture carried more weight than 1,000 passionate declarations. A war horn blew a second note from the courtyard. The vanguard was ready to march into the valley. Torin pulled away from her warmth. He picked up his fallen gauntlets. He did not look back as he walked toward the stone stairs. Looking back might have compromised his lethal focus. Ren stood alone on the freezing battlements. She watched him mount a massive black wool horse below. The iron gates screeched open to reveal the snowy battlefield. Torin drew his broadsword and spurred his horse forward. Thousands of northern soldiers marched out behind him. They looked like a small river flowing toward an ocean of fire. Ren gripped the golden seal against her chest. The metal slowly absorbed her body heat. The thick fog rolled in behind the departing army. It swallowed the king and his soldiers entirely. Ren remained on the high wall as the morning hours dragged on. She listened to the terrifying clash of steel echoing from the valley. The fate of the kingdom rested on the edge of his blade. Her rough hands traced the intricate carving of the wolf crest.
She possessed no noble blood to justify her standing. She lacked any formal education in warfare or statecraft. Yet she held the absolute loyalty of a mythic warlord. The sounds of screaming men carried over the winter wind. Smoke began to rise above the distant tree line. The scent of burning pine and copper reached the stone battlements. Wren refused to seek shelter in the lower levels of the keep. She stood rigidly against the stone parapet. Guards stationed along the wall cast nervous glances in her direction. Her unwavering presence offered them a strange sense of stability. If the queen did not flee, perhaps the fortress would hold. Hours bled into a grueling, agonizing afternoon. The noise of the distant battle shifted constantly. Sometimes it sounded dangerously close to the iron gates. Sometimes it faded into the far edges of the valley. Wren did not move from her vantage point. Her thin shoes offered little protection against the frozen stone. Her toes grew completely numb. She relied on the heavy wolf pelt to trap her body heat. A group of councilmen emerged from the spiral staircase. They approached her with hesitant, frightened steps. They were seeking permission to evacuate the royal treasury. Wren turned to face the terrified elders. She held up the golden seal for all of them to see. The block of gold caught the dim afternoon light. "No one leaves this fortress," Wren commanded evenly. The councilmen recognized the ultimate symbol of northern authority. They bowed their heads and retreated back into the tower. Wren turned her attention back to the obscured battlefield. The fog began to thicken as evening approached. The clash of steel eventually faded into an eerie silence. The battle had concluded in the valley below. Wren held her breath in the quiet twilight. She waited for a victor to emerge from the dense mist. She did not know if she would welcome a king or an executioner. Night fell heavily over the silent northern valley. The dense fog refused to lift from the stone battlements. Wren stood like a frozen statue against the parapet. The heavy wolf pelt was stiff with microscopic shards of ice. Her hands remained locked around the royal gold seal. The sharp edges of the metal dug into her skin. She welcomed the mild pain to maintain her focus. The deep silence of the battlefield felt more terrifying than the fighting. It offered no clues regarding the outcome of the war. The torches along the wall sputtered out, one by one. Guards held fresh bundles of wood to relight the iron sconces. Nobody dared to speak a word to the silent queen. A sudden sharp crunch of snow broke the quiet dark. The sound came from the road leading into the lower valley. Wren leaned over the stone ledge immediately. The armored sentries raised their long iron spears. A single horseman emerged slowly from the swirling mist. The massive black warhorse limped slightly on the icy ground. The rider sat heavily in the dark leather saddle. His steel argar was smeared with dark copper fluid. The distinctive silver wolf crest on his chest plate was barely visible. Wren felt her racing heart stop for a single beat. It was Torin. He had returned to his fortress entirely alone. He had left his commanders to secure the shattered valley. The iron gate groaned open with a loud screech. The king rode through the entrance without a sound. He dismounted heavily in the muddy courtyard below. Wren did not wait for him to climb the steep stairs. She turned and sprinted down the winding stone stairwell. Her simple leather shoes slapped against the flagstones. The black cloak trailed like a dark cloud behind her. She pushed past the gathering crowd of frightened servants. She burst through the entrance of the highest tower. Torin was already walking into the royal chamber. He had left a trail of melted snow in the corridor. He stopped in the center of the warm room. The fire in the hearth cast long shadows across his frame. He looked like a ghost returning from a terrible slaughter. His broad sword hung loosely from his uninjured hand. The steel blade was nicked and stained with war. He slowly turned his face toward the sound of her entrance. His amber eyes were bloodshot and heavy with raw exhaustion. He did not look like a triumphant conqueror. He looked like a man who had barely escaped the grave.
Torin let go of his heavy broadsword. The iron weapon clashed against the floorboards. He did not speak a single word of explanation. He did not describe the absolute destruction of the Southern vanguard. He had led 10,000 men to break 50,000 invaders. He had written a new legend in the crimson snow. None of that mattered to him in this quiet room. He took a deliberate step toward the tailor. Ren closed the remaining distance with rapid strides. She ignored the smell of iron and wood smoke clinging to him. She did not care about the dark stains coating his breastplate. She threw her arms around his massive neck. The cold metal of his armor dug into her soft chest. Torin wrapped his large arms around her small waist. He lifted her completely off the stone floorboards. He buried his face in the warm crook of her neck. A deep, ragged sigh escaped his cracked lips. The terrible tension finally left his massive frame. He held her against his heart, as if she were a lifeline. Ren held him back with every ounce of her strength. "You kept your promise," she whispered against his skin. Torin lowered her slowly until her feet touched the rug. He did not release his iron grip on her waist. He looked down into her wide amber eyes. The predatory gaze had completely vanished from his expression. He reached up with a trembling, bare hand. He cupped her chin with uncharacteristic gentleness. He leaned down slowly in the shifting firelight. His lips pressed against hers in a firm, deliberate kiss. The physical contact was devoid of simple lust. It was a profound seal of absolute ownership and devotion. The kiss tasted of winter wind and slit herbs from her salve. Ren closed her eyes and accepted the heavy weight of his love. The street tailor had found her sanctuary in a monster's arms. Torin had found his redemption in a commoner's touch. Torin pulled back a few inches to look at her face. His thumb traced the small scar on her lower lip. "The decoy bride is dead," Torin stated softly. His deep voice echoed pleasantly in the quiet room. "The North has only one true queen now." Ren reached into the folds of the black cloak. She withdrew the heavy block of forged gold. She placed the royal seal back into his calloused palm. "Your kingdom is safe, my lord," she said quietly. Torin tossed the priceless gold onto the wooden desk. He did not look at the symbol of his absolute power. He pulled her back against his steel chest plate. "The kingdom was never the prize, Ren." He rested his chin against the top of her dark hair. The fire crackled merrily in the stone hearth. The winter storm continued to howl outside the fortress walls. The Black Keep was surrounded by a mountain of dead enemies. Inside the royal chamber, a quiet peace had finally settled. Lord Vane had intended to use her as a disposable pawn. The ambitious nobility had planned a simple political deception. They had never anticipated the true nature of their Alpha King. Torin did not choose a bloodline to secure his throne. He had chosen the one soul that could soothe his darkness. The deception had concluded in the Grand Cathedral. The genuine marriage had just begun in the high tower. Ren wrapped her small fingers around his large hand. She looked at the golden signet ring on her finger. The heavy metal no longer felt like a terrifying trap. It felt like a permanent anchor to a quiet devotion. She was no longer a peasant hiding behind a lace veil. She was the anchor that held the wildest beast in the north. Torin squeezed her hand with careful, loving strength. They stood together by the war fireplace as dawn approached. The darkness of their past lives had finally burned away. The future belonged to the tailor and the king. And so, the decoy bride found her true sanctuary in the arms of a monster. Fellow romantics, if this story warmed your evening, consider joining our little channel. Leave your listening city in the comments below, and tell me, did Torin's quiet devotion win your heart too? Until our next tale, keep the hearth fires burning.